So I asked all of you to discuss your favorite places for heart to hearts or deep, meaningful conversations, because that's the setting for today's gospel passage. Similar to the walk of Cleopas and his companion on the road to Emmaus, my go to place to talk is on the road. Whether I'm driving on Lakeshore Drive with my partner, or I'm exploring the back roads around my small Kansas hometown with my mom, I find something about being on the open road in a car, listening to music, to be such a great place to open up and to share. And as I read our gospel passage today, I found myself drawn to the image of the road. Immediately, I had songs start coming to mind. There's the always catchy Old Town Road by Lil Nas X that took the world by storm last year. A personal favorite of mine, Red Dirt Road by country duo Brooks and Dunn, and Hit the Road Jack, made famous by the late Ray Charles. But the song that nestled its way into my brain and has stuck with me since is the song Boulevard of Broken Dreams by punk rock band Green Day. Many of you are probably familiar with this song. It tends to be one of those songs that when you hear the opening line, you can't help but jump in and sing along. I walk a lonely road, the only one that I have ever known. Don't know where it goes, but it's home to me and I walk alone. Obviously, these lyrics might not seem like they match up with the gospel passage on first glance. Sure, these two people are walking on a road, but they are not alone. They have one another and they have the stranger who walks with them. In fact, chances are there were many people on the road that day. The text tells us that they were on a 7-mile journey between Jerusalem and Emmaus, a road on which at least one other person was likely to have crossed their paths. But the literal road that these two men are on is not necessarily the point that I want to focus on this morning. Roads are a common theme for the author of Luke. The parable of the Good Samaritan takes place on a road. And in the Gospel of Luke's companion book, the book of Acts, the Apostle Paul encounters Jesus on the road to Damascus. Roads were an intentional symbol for the author of Luke. As New Testament scholar Eric Barreto writes, there is something about travel that evokes Luke's literary and theological imagination. There's something about roads, the way roads bring us together, the way roads can pose a danger to us all, the way roads become a symbol of a faith on the move. The physical road between Jerusalem and Emmaus is not the only road that these two people, Cleopas and his unnamed companion, find themselves on. They are also navigating the road of grief. And as many of you know, the road of grief is often the hardest road that we will ever travel. The Reverend Robert Hawk wrote, "There are some walks that are longer than others, not because of the miles or even because of the landscape, but because of the burdens." It's likely that these two people had walked this road between Jerusalem and Emmaus before, but this time it must have felt even more burdensome. This walk happens on Easter Sunday. These two devout followers of Jesus had just lost their friend, their teacher, the one in whom they had hoped, in such a horrific death 3 days prior. And as they are wrestling with this unbearable grief, the grief of, yes, losing a person, but also the grief of losing all of their hope, they hear some unbelievable news. Some of the women in their cohort had been to Jesus' tomb and had found it empty. These women are claiming that angels appeared to them and told them that Jesus had risen from the dead. But it couldn't be, could it? These women must have been hallucinating. There's just no way. I mean, that's what these two men are discussing and processing together on the road that evening. Their hopes had been destroyed. Their hearts had been broken. They know that the journey to move on, the journey to find new hope and new meaning will be the longest journeys of their lives. And as they're trying to take those first steps, the women show up with these incredible claims, and all of a sudden everything starts to look really confusing and feel really overwhelming. I've navigated the road of grief before. In fact, it kind of feels like that's what I'm doing right now. I'm grieving the loss of normalcy, a sense of control, physical touch, and socializing. I grieve the loss of days where I didn't have to think about symptoms and infection rates and death totals. And just like every other experience of grief I've had before, this moment does feel awfully lonely at times. That feeling of loneliness is made worse by mandated distance. But what has been surprising for me is that there are days where I find safety in the familiarity of that loneliness. Like Green Day sings, that lonely road can start to feel like home. And the idea of that home going away, of that loneliness going away, is terrifying. Because I'm scared that as soon as I feel hopeful again, as soon as I feel safe again, the virus or something worse will come back with a vengeance. And I don't know if I'm brave enough to face that possibility, to find hope in hopelessness. It reminds me of the saying, better the devil you know than the devil you don't. I wonder if Cleopas and his companion felt that way. If what the women shared was even more terrifying to them than the thought of facing the total loss of Jesus' death. I imagine that the conflicting emotions of despair and hope felt like 1,000-pound weights on their shoulders. I wonder if, like me, the last thing they wanted to do was explain how they were feeling to someone else. When that strange man approached them on the road to ask them what they were talking about, did they roll their eyes at him? I mean, they are devastated by the loss of Jesus, confused by what the women have shared, and then some stranger walks up and wants them to talk about it. When I read their response to the man, I can hear their annoyance. I mean, the line, "Are you the only stranger in Jerusalem who does not know the things that have taken place there in these days?" is akin to, "Have you been living under a rock? Where have you been?" If I were Cleopas or his companion, I would have been tempted to tell this man, "Mind your business," and shoo him away. Perhaps they were tempted, but for whatever reason, they go ahead and they explain the situation to the man. Now, we as the reader know something that Cleopas and his companion do not know. This strange man is no stranger at all. It is the risen Christ. It's pretty hilarious to imagine Jesus listening to these two men explain to him what he had lived and died and lived again through. But Jesus is there, patiently listening to them process everything they had gone through. But even as Cleopas and his companion detail exactly what happened to Jesus, even as Jesus then gives them this sermon, going through everything the scriptures foretold about him and what would happen to him, they still do not recognize who they are speaking to. It's not until much later, when their walk ends and Jesus breaks bread and blesses it, recreating the Last Supper, that their eyes are finally opened to who had been beside them the entire time. A lot has been happening in our world, and we are all processing and coping with that on our own individual roads. And for some, that road is more burdensome than others. Sure, we are all experiencing this pandemic simultaneously, but the reality is that this virus, or at least the response to it, does in fact discriminate. Systemic classism, racism, ableism, and xenophobia are on full display. The message being sent by some is that the lives of the poor, of Black and brown folks, of the disabled, of the incarcerated, of immigrants and refugees are expendable. Some are willing to sacrifice the lives of the most vulnerable in order to get back to theirs a little faster. And the very people and institutions who are supposed to help us find our way out are fumbling the ball on every play. People are sick and dying alone, separated from the people they love. Essential workers risk their lives every single day to keep things going. The future is uncertain. Some think we will begin to re-enter normal life, whatever that is, in the coming weeks, but others are far less optimistic. And that uncertainty, that combination of despair and hope, feels unbearable, feels overwhelming. And when we don't know what else to do, we just put our heads down and we keep walking and walking and walking. And that road of grief and fear feels a lot like what the lyrics of Boulevard of Broken Dreams go on to say. My shadow's the only one that walks beside me. My shallow heart's the only thing that's beating. Sometimes I wish someone out there will find me. Till then, I walk alone. For some folks, finding hope in hopelessness comes easier than others. And for those people, I am eternally grateful. But I'm not in the business of enforcing hope. I know that sometimes grief and anger and fear demand to be felt. So I'm not here to tell you that you have to find a silver lining in this moment or any moment. For some, that feels like an impossible task. For others of you walking this road, you can see the end in sight. When Jesus approaches you, you know exactly who he is right away, and you feel good, or at least like you can keep going. But for others, hope isn't coming that easily. Some of us need to see Jesus breaking the bread for that hope to come. And my friends, the good news is that no matter where you are at on your road, no matter how long it takes you to recognize the man beside you, no matter what, Jesus is there. And Jesus listens to our hopes and our fears, our celebrations and our crying out, our joy and our anger, everything we are processing and fighting through. Jesus is listening. Even if you walk in silence, Jesus listens to that too, whether you know he's there or not. And that is one of the most beautiful things about God. You don't have to recognize God for God to be at work in the world. Some walks are longer than others. I wish I could tell you with certainty that whatever long, lonely, arduous walk that you are on is almost finished. I can't predict the future, but when the days that hope comes to me, I hope that when this walk is over, we will sit at a table together. I hope that on that day we will break bread and the work of God will be more evident to us than ever before. And I hope that we will leave that meal together and greet the new, different world that we will inevitably encounter with open hearts to do the work God has for us. Because you better believe God has work for us and God will have work for us. But until then, my friends, we keep walking. Amen.